John Carter shifted the strap of his duffel bag and exhaled a long breath as he entered Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. It was an ordinary morning, the bustle of travelers filling the terminal. He blended seamlessly into the crowd, just another face among thousands, a faceless passenger in the sea of activity. This was the way it was meant to be. No VIP treatment, no private lounges. Today, John Carter was just another traveler flying coach, blending in as an average passenger on a routine flight to Chicago. No one knew who he really was. The plan had been simple, almost too simple. Observe, evaluate, and truly understand the experience of the average traveler from the ground up. As CEO of Skyway Airlines, John had always believed in leading by example. He had always made it a point to see firsthand the realities that passengers faced. If he wanted to improve the airline, he needed to walk in their shoes. This wasn't about being comfortable or sitting in first class. It was about seeing things as they truly were. The frustrations, the discomforts, the little moments of tension that could make or break the travel experience. As John approached Gate C-23, something changed. He noticed a supervisor standing near the counter, scanning the crowd intently. He was dressed in the standard Skyway uniform, but his posture was rigid, almost too alert. His name tag read Mike Reynolds, and John's practiced eye noticed the sharpness in his demeanor, the way he observed every movement of the passengers around him. It was a subtle but unsettling sign that something wasn't quite right. John barely had time to check the overhead display for his gate number when Mike's voice cut through the ambient noise of the terminal. "Excuse me, sir. Are you in the right place?" John turned toward him, meeting Mike's scrutinizing gaze. "Yes, Skyway Flight 317 to Chicago. Correct?" Mike studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing as they flicked over John's attire. Plain gray hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. There was something in the way Mike looked at him that made John feel as though he didn't belong. Mike's voice was colder now, more deliberate. "Can I see your ticket?" John hesitated but handed over his phone, displaying his first-class boarding pass. Mike took his time, scanning the screen, tilting it in his hand as though searching for something. The passengers around them passed through, some barely glancing at their tickets before being waved along, but John felt the weight of Mike's gaze on him. His boarding pass was treated as if it were counterfeit, a potential threat. Mike's lips pressed into a thin, tight line. "Do you have ID?" John's jaw clenched, irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "I already went through TSA." "I understand that, sir," Mike replied, his voice stiff. "But I still need to verify." Before John could respond, a blonde woman in her late 30s, also in Skyway uniform, leaned over and whispered something to Mike. Her name tag read Samantha Walsh. Mike's expression darkened, and he looked back at John, his eyes now filled with suspicion. "Sir," Mike said with a formal tone, "I need you to step aside." John exhaled slowly, the words he wanted to say bubbling up, but he suppressed them. He glanced at the other passengers around him, a middle-aged man in a suit, a college student with earbuds, an elderly couple holding hands. None of them were being stopped or questioned, only him. A few feet away, a young black man in a leather jacket, Ethan Blake, watched the interaction carefully. John caught a glimpse of Ethan's phone, angled slightly, the camera lens barely visible as it recorded. "Is there a problem?" John asked, his voice even but thick with restraint. Mike's jaw tightened. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. Just following protocol." "Suspicious activity?" John's heart rate quickened, but he forced a smile, cold and calculated. "I see. And does protocol only apply to certain passengers?" Mike stiffened, but before he could respond, two uniformed officers approached. Their presence added a heavy weight to the moment, one that John had hoped to avoid. "Sir, we need you to come with us," said Officer Daniels, a tall man with a stern expression. "Just a quick additional screening." The terminal buzzed with whispers, some passengers pretending not to watch, others glancing over with unapologetic curiosity. John felt the familiar weight of humiliation settle in his chest. He could have shown them his business card, could have announced who he was, demanded to speak with the airport manager, shut the whole thing down in seconds. But he didn't. He didn't need to. Instead, he lifted his chin slightly, the fire in his chest buried beneath a veil of calm. and followed the officers. 10 minutes later, John sat stiffly in the sterile, windowless security office, a cold metal table separating him from officers Daniels and Baker. They loomed over him, their eyes narrowed, their posture rigid, as though he were already guilty of something. Daniels spoke first, arms crossed. "Mind telling us what you were doing at Gate C-23? John's lips quirked into a bitter smile. "Boarding my flight, like everyone else." Baker scribbled something on a notepad, his pen tapping as he glanced up. "Do you fly often?" John's brow furrowed. "What kind of question is that?" "We just need to establish some details," Daniels answered, his tone dismissive. John's arms folded across his chest. "Details? Like the fact that I'm a paying customer with a valid boarding pass? Or that I'm being detained for absolutely no reason?" Daniels leaned forward, his gaze cold. "Look, sir, you're free to cooperate, or we can make this a lot more complicated." John met his stare without flinching. "Trust me, you already have." At Skyway Airlines' New York headquarters, Lisa Monroe's phone buzzed in the middle of a meeting. She had just stepped into the conference room when she saw the urgent message notification. "We have a situation. Check the video." Her stomach sank as she clicked the link, her fingers trembling slightly. A viral Twitter post flashed on the screen. "Black man harassed and detained at DFW airport for looking suspicious while trying to board his flight. Turns out, he's John Carter, CEO of Skyway Airlines. Racial profiling, child discrimination." Lisa froze, staring at the video. She could see it all. Mike Reynolds, Samantha Walsh, the two officers, and John, standing there calm, though visibly frustrated. The video was already making waves. Her heart raced, but there was no time to process. The entire board of directors was already in the conference room. She swallowed hard, then pressed the call button. "We have a problem." At the airport, the security office door swung open. Mike Reynolds entered first, looking pale. Behind him was the airport manager, his voice tight as he spoke. "Mr. Carter, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding." John's voice was dangerously calm. "Misunderstanding? That's what you're calling it?" Mike didn't speak, his gaze fixed on his phone, where notifications and missed calls flashed across the screen. His eyes darted nervously as the manager cleared his throat and addressed the situation. "Effective immediately, Mr. Reynolds and Ms. Walsh have been relieved of their duties." Mike's head snapped up in disbelief. "Wait, what? You're firing me?" The manager's voice was flat. "Yes, Mike. You and Samantha both. The company won't tolerate this kind of behavior." John watched the realization spread across Mike's face. He wanted to protest, to defend himself, but it was too late. The decision had been made. For a moment, John felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, just a bone-deep exhaustion. This wasn't over, not even close. John stood and adjusted his hoodie, the weight of the moment settling over him. "I'll be leaving now," he said quietly, his voice steady. No one stopped him as he walked out of the security office. Outside, the tension hadn't lifted. Passengers still lingered near Gate C-23, whispering and stealing glances at him. Some had witnessed the entire incident firsthand. Others had already seen the viral video. John Carter, CEO of Skyway Airlines, had just learned an important lesson. The price of visibility, even in the most mundane of moments, could be steep. And this was only the beginning. John took a deep breath, leaning forward in his chair. He knew he had Coldwell cornered, but this was the moment to push. "You're not in control anymore, Martin," John said, his voice low and steady. "You thought you could play this game with me, but you didn't understand the rules." Coldwell's laughter faltered. "You're making a mistake, Carter. This won't end well for you." John's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You think this is about me? This is about a company that's built on deceit and manipulation. It's about all the people you've tried to crush to climb higher, the employees you've tossed aside, the customers you've exploited. But that's over now. You're not getting out of this." John's eyes never left the screen where Coldwell's downfall was unfolding in real time. Headlines flashed about the scandal, stock prices plummeted, and the pressure was mounting. It was clear the board would turn on Coldwell. They had no other choice. "You're out, Martin. The game's over." There was a long pause, then Coldwell's voice cracked, no longer the confident CEO John had once feared. "You can't do this." "I already have." John hung up before Coldwell could respond. He leaned back in his chair, watching as the fallout from the scandal continued to ripple through the media and stock markets. The war had been fought and won. Lisa entered the room, looking at him with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You sure about this?" John nodded slowly, feeling the weight of everything he had just done. "I'm sure. It's not just about the company anymore. It's about making sure something like this never happens again." The sound of a buzzing phone broke the silence. John glanced at it, his eyes narrowing when he saw the latest headline. "Breaking news. North Star CEO Martin Coldwell resigns amid growing scandal." John closed his eyes for a moment, a rare sense of satisfaction settling over him. But he knew the fight wasn't over. The battle for justice, for change, for a place where people like him didn't have to prove their worth every damn day. That battle would continue, and now John Carter was ready to lead it. "You underestimated me, Martin. That was your first mistake. A beat." Then Caldwell hung up. John Carter smirked, sensing victory. That was also Martin's last mistake. By the end of the day, North Star Airlines had issued a statement over the loudspeakers. Effective immediately, CEO Martin Caldwell is stepping down. North Star Airlines remains steadfast in its commitment to fairness and integrity within the aviation industry. John read it over lunch. Victory had never tasted so sweet. But the battle was far from over. The morning after Caldwell's resignation, the aviation world was still in turmoil. John sat in his office, sipping his usual black coffee, while the news anchors dissected the aftermath. CNN. North Star Airlines in crisis. How far did the sabotage go? Bloomberg. John Carter emerges stronger after corporate attack. Fox Business. Will this scandal prompt changes in airline industry policies? John sat back, watching the chaos unfold. Winning a battle didn't mean winning the war. The system was still broken, and the fight had only just begun. Lisa Monroe walked in, her heels clicking on the polished floor, a thick folder in her hands. She placed it on his desk. "Legal and HR compiled everything. We're getting requests from other CEOs on how to handle racial bias internally." John raised an eyebrow. "Now they care?" Lisa sat down, shaking her head. "The board wants to know our next move." John closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in. Then he picked up his phone and dialed. "Arrow, calling FAA Director's Office. It's time to make real changes." North Star Airlines was spiraling, but John's vision was already beginning to take shape. Meanwhile, at North Star, things had only grown worse. The company's stock had plummeted 14%, and customers were canceling flights by the thousands. The board had forced Caldwell out, but they needed a scapegoat. Enter Daniel Pierce, the senior VP of operations. He was thrown under the bus with a loudspeaker announcement. "North Star Airlines strongly condemns the unethical behavior of former executive Daniel Pierce, who acted without the company's knowledge. We remain committed to fair business practices." John read the statement and couldn't help but laugh bitterly. It was a lie. Pierce had been nothing but a pawn in Caldwell's game. But it didn't matter to John anymore. Revenge wasn't his goal anymore. He had bigger plans, a policy shift that would change the entire aviation industry. Within a week, John made his next move. Loudspeaker. Skyway Airlines announces a groundbreaking initiative, mandatory racial bias training for all employees, a new passenger rights policy to prevent discrimination, and collaboration with other airlines to push for federal policy changes. The phone buzzed incessantly as executives from Delta, United, and American Airlines reached out, scrambling to join the movement. For years, these companies had ignored racial profiling issues, but not anymore. Lisa walked in, holding up her phone. "The FAA just confirmed a meeting next week. They want your input." John nodded. "Good. Let's make sure this never happens again." Meanwhile, in Dallas, the fallout continued. Mike Reynolds sat alone in a cheap motel room, scrolling through job listings. His Twitter rants defending himself had only worsened his situation. He had gone from a respected supervisor at a major airline to completely unemployable overnight. Envelope with Arrow new email. Your application for X Airlines has been declined. Mike slammed his laptop shut. He had thought that playing along with North Star's scheme would get him ahead. Instead, he had lost everything. Samantha Walsh, on the other hand, had hired a lawyer. She was suing for wrongful termination, claiming she had simply followed orders. John didn't care about either of them anymore. They weren't his problem. Meanwhile, Ethan Blake, the lawyer who had filmed the initial incident, sat in a high-rise office in Chicago. He opened an email. Envelope with arrow subject, partner promotion announcement. His firm had taken notice of how he had handled the situation, not just filming, but spreading the truth. Now he was being made a full partner. One small act had completely altered the course of his life. John Carter, meanwhile, was preparing for his next steps. A week later, John boarded a flight to San Francisco, where he was scheduled to meet with civil rights leaders and aviation executives. As he approached the gate, a Skyway Airlines employee looked up. Recognition flashed across his face. For a split second, John expected the same cold treatment as before, but instead the employee straightened up and nodded with respect. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter." John smiled, handing over his ticket. This time, no one asked for extra identification. And for the first time in weeks, John Carter simply felt like a man boarding a plane. Exactly how it should be. As the flight cruised at 35,000 feet, the hum of the engines and the faint chatter of passengers filled the air. It was a routine flight, nothing extraordinary. Yet, everything had changed for him. He had spent years building his reputation, breaking barriers, leading with integrity. But in that single moment standing at gate C-23, everything had been stripped away. He had been reminded of exactly who he was in this country. But now, the world had changed too. CNN, Skyway Airlines' new policies spark industry-wide reform. Bloomberg, John Carter named most influential CEO of the year after landmark aviation changes. Forbes, the man who took on North Star Airlines and won. Lisa Monroe had sent him the articles that morning. He should have felt victorious, but instead he felt drained. "Mr. Carter?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. John turned to see a young flight attendant, a warm smile on her face. She hesitated before speaking. "I just wanted to say, what you did, it mattered." John held her gaze. It wasn't just about winning. It was about ensuring that no one else would ever go through what he had. He nodded. "Thank you." A year later, the aviation industry had transformed. All major U.S. airlines had adopted Skyway's anti-discrimination policies. The FAA had implemented mandatory racial bias training for airport security and staff. Passengers now had stronger protections against profiling. As for North Star Airlines, their stock never fully recovered. The new CEO issued a formal apology, but it was too little, too late. Passengers weren't so quick to forget. Meanwhile, at Skyway Airlines, John sat at the head of the boardroom, watching as the directors unanimously approved his final proposal, a new scholarship program to help underrepresented students enter the aviation industry. Lisa Monroe smirked from across the table. "You'll move North Star, won't you?" John chuckled. "They're not playing in our league anymore." Final scene. A moment of peace. That evening, John walked through Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. No bodyguards, no assistants. Just a man walking through an airport, unencumbered. This time no one stopped him. No one questioned him. He smiled to himself, feeling something he hadn't in a long time. Freedom.